So conditioning. So basically I break this into two things, general and specific, right? So general, meaning like you are a human being and all human beings need certain qualities just to function well and to be human beings. Like for example, all human beings need to sleep, right? That's just kind of a general rule, right? And there's more things that people have as overlap versus they don't have overlap, right? So there's more general kind of recommendations that actually apply here, and people don't like the word general, but again, they apply to everyone, and it's something that's super relevant, so we need to obey that, right? So again, I would say the general is just as important, especially most of the time, and the specific is just something that we need to layer on as we kind of need to sacrifice some of those other qualities as we get closer to the competitive season. If we're talking about conditioning as this, the specific thing here, is that we need the athlete, regardless of what sport they're in, to have basic aerobic function. All right. So, what I mean by that is, so the aerobic system is across the board something that needs to, regardless of what that athlete's kind of time domain is, that system's always running. And what I mean by that is, like, oftentimes people think like, something like football where you like work for like 6 seconds, right? And then you have 60 seconds rest. That's an anaerobic sport because, it's not in the presence of oxygen or something like that, right? Or it's like, well, how do you think they recover in between bouts? Like, how do you think that they actually are able to sustain repeating those anaerobic efforts over time? It's the aerobic system that allows for that, right? So basically, if you're creating fatigue really quickly, I like to use like the analogy of like a boat, where like if you are in a boat and you are like, shooting like a BB gun in the bottom of your boat, if you have a little sump pump, it's just gonna clean it out, and it's not going to be an issue. That's your aerobic system. If you're not doing much work, much damage to yourself, then it's not going to accumulate much fatigue because that aerobic system can account for that, right? Whereas if you take like a shotgun or a cannonball, right, and you blast the bottom of your boat like you do an assault bike sprint, right, like for like 60 seconds, max effort, you're kind of be swamped, right? Like the whole thing's going to come under. You create a lot of damage, a lot of fatigue. You're going to have to like pail it out. Like that's your anaerobic system. The sump pump's still working, right? It just needs some help, right? So that's the idea here, is that regardless of which type of athlete you are, you have to have the aerobic functioning, because that's what allows you to, again, between bouts, recover, right? But also between sessions and then over kind of course of training years, right? So kind of getting that baseline volume, that accumulation, is what's going to allow for that, right? So here would be one that I would give to somebody like Abby, right, or even Ian. These are both appropriate for them. Just 25 minutes moving through this, and it would just be, you can see all of them, that they're really simple movements like the assault bike, different static holds, again, relatively slow paces on ergs, it's just some like carries, some things that would not be super challenging, right? And realize that even if I broke this up, say I had an athlete who isn't quite at that level, I can very easily just divide all of those numbers in that list in half, and they're almost going to get the same amount of work done over the course of that 25 minutes. So even if I only had them do 5 calories at a time, a 15-second hold, 6 reps at a time, right? Like they're just going to get through those rounds about twice as quick, right? And they're just going to have less local fatigue as they do that. So there's no real disadvantage to going less on something like that when it's, a time priority. So some things that, again, this is basic aerobic function. This is not really supposed to be high-end conditioning. If you're like dying during this, you're doing it wrong, right? Especially if you're a football player, right? Because now you can't squat heavy after this, right? So the goal here is to be able to give this to someone and they can walk away from it and be like, yeah, it didn't really feel like a workout, right? It was just kind of like moving, right? That's the goal, right? So what constitutes basic aerobic functioning, like that sort of workout? Maintenance of nasal breathing, that's the number one thing, right? So if I'm prescribing a movement to someone and they're not able to breathe through their nose as they're doing it, they've lost control, that's not something that's aerobic anymore, right? 2, they have a relaxed gaze, like so they actually have access to their peripheral vision, right? So they're being able to not really have that tunnel vision where you're sympathetic, you're like everything, all the systems are coming online, we're like fight or flight, where it's becoming more stressful to that athlete. Easiest way to tell that is, can you kind of like keep a relaxed gaze and actually be able to keep that peripheral vision, right? Conversational all day pace, in the sense that like you could like talk to someone as you're going through this, right? Like that's the idea. Again, just another way to measure, is this actually something that's stressful to you or not? Sustainable movement, right? So we're not actually having like local occlusion or fatigue. So if a muscle's really burning a lot while you're doing this, again, you picked probably a variation that's too challenging. And again, sometimes it's fine that like some of these aren't 100% obeyed all the time, but these are just, again, for the most part, you're trying to obey these most of the time. So for example, during that farmer's walk, your forearms are probably going to get a little bit of a pump there, and that's perfectly fine, because again, you're going to move on to something else and you're going to be able to flush that out, right? But in general, we're trying to obey these, again, most of the time. All right, and then lastly, parasympathetic nervous system tone. And again, basically, if we followed all the ones before that, you're going to get that, where again, it's something where you're allowing yourself to kind of be calm and relaxed and kind of moving through that. All right, so again, I would give that to any athlete regardless of what they are. Obviously, movement selection is going to change. The kind of even intensity in terms of like paces for wattages or the length of time that they're going to be doing something is going to change. But again, I'm going to give that to almost all athletes, especially in the off season. So energy systems training, and now this is again something that's more specific, and it could be, depending on the athlete, much more challenging for them, right? And sometimes that means, one of the things you have to do here with the energy systems is that you need to be able to explain to an athlete what the purpose of something is, right? So, for example, like a really common thing is if you have someone who's like a power athlete, say that they're, you know, a sprinter or a football player or a volleyball player, something that's explosive, right? You need to have them have a really short time duration and to be fully rested when they do that to be able to get maximal power, right? And that's not all athletes, but for those athletes, that's what they need, right? So part of your job is to educate them that like this isn't necessarily going to feel like a super challenging workout because you're going to be fully rested each time you do it, right? If you work for 8 seconds and you rest for 90 seconds or 2 minutes, that's going to feel like you're just standing around most of your workout. Well, that is what you're doing, right? So it's just a matter of actually educating them and being like, hey, this isn't going to be a super painful workout where you're left laying on the floor, and that doesn't mean that it's not a good session, that you're not going to get better from it, right? And again, that's just one of the things that you have to educate them about, right? Other athletes, they are going to be in the more of kind of that pain energy system or the sustained energy system, where depending on their time domain, that is going to be a much more challenging effort to repeat, right? And again, this gets really complicated, but we just got to go back to what sport are they in, right? So like, again, if we have a field hockey athlete, think about what's that actually going to be looking like when they're in their sport. Like they're going to be jogging some of the time, walking a bit of the time, and then occasionally have to do like a max effort sprint, usually fairly short, sometimes intermediate, a little bit longer, right? So create a energy systems protocol, a conditioning protocol that is kind of based around that, where it's like these are demands. It's kind of like a, you know, moderate, low, most of the time, occasionally sprint, right? So again, that's going to mean that sometimes we do sustainable efforts where you're going to be going for a period of time and you get kind of high-low work periods, and then other times where it's kind of like a sprint rest, right? So there's multiple different ways to do intervals in that sense, right? Realize, again, the biggest thing here for all of these is that we're talking about maximal time duration here, right? So if you are going for 20 seconds on the assault bike and you're at 300 watts and you're like a big dude, right? That's not maximal, so you're not in the sprint energy system, right? You're not in that really fast time demand, right? Like that was sustainable effort, right? It might be some, fatigue accumulation, but there's going to be relatively low, right? Whereas again, if we're talking about max effort, that's where if we go back to this. That's where you're going to need that to obey that kind of that work to rest ratio. Okay? And it's just something that you got to think about, right? If I have an athlete do that max effort sprint and they're on there for 20 seconds, that's perfectly fine. But I'm going to have to give them like a 1 to 8 or a 1 to 12 work rest in order for them to be able to repeat that. Right? And it's fine if I like within my design, I'm like, yeah, you're not gonna be able to repeat that, and I want to for some reason use that as a teaching tool or something like that. That's fine, but it's just something that you need to know, right? So if I want them to be able to match their wattage or something like that, like some metric, I have to be able to give them that appropriate work to rest there. Right. Does that make sense? Right. So another thing to think about, the ends of the spectrum here are actually where you want to spend more of your time in terms of, unless that athlete has a sport-specific demand to be in that lactic acid, the pain kind of threshold, that kind of intermediate time domain, that's super painful efforts. Like think about like a 400 meter max effort run, right? It's kind of known for being like a really painful race, right? That's something that's going to create a really big recovery deficit. It's going to take them a long time to recover from that, and it's something that is kind of mentally and physically very draining for that athlete to be able to repeat. Versus something like a truly max effort sprint that is staying in sort of that phosphocreatine energy system is going to, again, not be very challenging to in terms of like mentally or physically to be able to repeat if you're given like the proper rest. So for example, like a 12-second assault bike sprint, you might be breathing hard after that, but you didn't really have that fatigue set in yet, right? Versus if you went another 8 seconds, all of a sudden that gets way harder, right? Because you're starting to transition into a different energy system, right? So again, if we give more sprint and more sustain, kind of focusing on the ends of the spectrum, especially in the off season, that's just going to allow the athlete to kind of accumulate more volume in kind of both those ends. And then only kind of going towards the pain if we actually need that for their specific sport, right? Again, there's no reason to kind of really move a football player to there, because even if they're moving at 100 yards down the field, or they're probably not going to take more than 10 or 12 seconds to do that, right? And that's a very rare case, right? So in that case, I just need them to be able to recover in between bouts, which is the sustain, right? And then we go to sprint. Right? So again, some athletes some of the time are going to be coming in pain, but again, I think that's a rarer case. Right? I would also say that's true for GPP clients, that you want to spend more time in the kind of the ends of the spectrum and less in the middle, just because again they probably don't have, or they're not optimized to recover from that, right? Like they probably have more outside of training stressors. They probably don't sleep that great. They might have diseases or disorders that are preventing them from recovering super well. So we need to be, again, educating them, because like this workout might not kick your butt in that sense, right? But it's still going to allow you to adapt better.